You genuinely believed your mother's cottage would be yours? The husband sneered. She signed it over to me ages ago. He got into his car and drove away, leaving me alone at the cemetery. I was already bracing myself for the 15-kilometer walk home when a black SUV pulled up beside me. The window rolled down, and a man asked, "You are Maria, the daughter of the woman who saved my life many years ago, and before we continue, please write down which country you are from and how old you are. Enjoy the listening." The weather that day was unforgiving. A damp autumn wind swirled between the old linden trees of the cemetery, tearing leaves from their branches and scattering them at the feet of those who had come to bid farewell to my mother. I stood by the freshly dug grave, still struggling to accept her absence. Nearby, a little apart, stood my husband, Artyom. He held a cigarette in his hand, his gaze vacant and weary, as if he were not at his mother-in-law's funeral, but merely a bystander caught in a crowd. I longed for him to show just a sliver of empathy, to place a hand on my shoulder, to utter a kind word. Instead, he gave a barely perceptible smirk and leaned in close, ensuring no one else could hear. "Did you truly think your mother's cottage would end up with you?" he chuckled. "She signed it over to me ages ago." My heart lurched. I froze, unable to comprehend what I had just heard. "What?" I whispered. "Precisely what you heard." His eyes gleamed with a cold, triumphant malice. "It's mine now. And you? Well, you're still mine." In that moment, I lacked even the strength to weep. I gazed at the disturbed earth at my feet, not realizing he had chosen my most vulnerable hour to deliver his blow. When the service concluded, people began to disperse. I lingered by the grave, placing a small bouquet of white chrysanthemums, my mother's favorites, upon it, and whispered, "Forgive me, Mommy." The sound of a car door slamming shut reached me from behind. I turned. Artyom was getting into his car. "Let's go," he tossed out. "I want to stay a little longer," I murmured. "Do as you please," he retorted, and shut the door with a definitive click. A second later, the engine roared to life and the car sped away, leaving me utterly alone amidst the tombstones and fallen leaves. Silence descended upon me like a heavy bell. The journey back would be approximately 15 kilometers. No buses ran this far out, and even if I had wanted to, I couldn't have called a taxi. My phone had died that morning. A thought struck me. This was how he had abandoned me after my mother's funeral, leaving me stranded in the middle of the cemetery. I stood there, unsure which way to turn, when the rumble of an engine sounded behind me. A black SUV was slowly making its way down the narrow lane between the trees. The vehicle stopped beside me. The window glided down. Behind the wheel sat a man in his early 50s, well-built, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a composed expression. "Excuse me," he said. "Are you Maria?" I nodded in surprise. "Yes." "And who are you?" The man paused for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts before speaking. "I am Ivan Sergeyevich. And you, Maria, are the daughter of the woman who saved my life many years ago." I stared at him, stunned. "You knew my mother?" "I did." A note of firmness entered his voice. "And now it is my turn to repay her kindness. Please get in the car. You shouldn't remain here alone." I hesitated for only an instant. My husband's words still echoed in my mind. "She signed it over to me ages ago." The words blurred into one, and perhaps it was this confusion that prompted me to trust a stranger. I opened the door and slid inside. The interior smelled of leather and a faint hint of coffee. The man started the engine, and we began to move slowly. "Tell me," I said softly, "how did you know my mother?" He offered a slight smile, but it held more sadness than joy. "It's a long story. About 25 years ago, I was in a terrible accident. They barely pulled me out from under the car, and at the hospital, all the doctors just shook their heads. My chances were slim. And it was your mother. She was working as a nurse in the intensive care unit back then. She fought for me through the nights, staying awake, doing everything she could. I survived. Since then, I've always considered her an angel." I listened, my heart aching. I had never known this episode from my mother's life. She had never spoken of it. I searched for an opportunity to thank her, but she always refused. Ivan Sergeyevich continued. She said she was simply doing her job, but I promised myself that if her family ever needed help, I would do everything in my power. He glanced at me. It seems this is that time. We drove in silence for a few more minutes. I watched the fields through the window, the low clouds that threatened to unleash rain. My thoughts swirled. My husband had deceived me. The cottage was no longer mine. He hadn't even stayed with me on the day of the funeral. A decision began to form within me. Something in my life needed to change. Ivan Sergeyevich seemed to read my mind. "Maria," he said, his voice soft yet firm. "You must understand. Your husband didn't do this without reason. If your mother transferred the house to him, it means he somehow convinced or coerced her. I've encountered people like that, but believe me, the truth always comes out." I shivered. "You think he deceived her?" "I think the documents should be examined, and if everything was indeed handled improperly, we can restore justice." I nodded. In that moment, for the first time in years, a flicker of hope ignited within me. By the time we reached the city, it was already dark. Ivan Sergeyevich stopped the car at the entrance to my building. "Here is my number." He handed me a business card. "Call me tomorrow morning and we'll start looking into this." I took the card, tucked it into my purse, and quietly said, "Thank you." He nodded and drove away. I went up to the apartment. Artyom was already home, sitting with a glass of whiskey in front of the television. "Took you long enough," he grumbled, not even turning his head. I walked silently into the bedroom, closed the door, and broke down. Tears flowed, but deep down I knew that tomorrow would mark the beginning of something new. Morning greeted me with a throbbing headache and an inner emptiness. It felt as though the night had offered not a single moment of sleep. I lay staring at the ceiling, trying to piece my thoughts together. On the bedside table lay Ivan Sergeyevich's business card. The white card with its crisp black lettering seemed like more than just a piece of paper now. It felt like a doorway to a new life, to opportunities I hadn't had in a long time. The clinking of dishes drifted from the kitchen. Artyom seemed to be having breakfast. I hesitated, but then I got up, washed my face, and stepped into the hallway. He was sitting at the table, casually scrolling through the news on his phone. "Finally awake," he remarked indifferently. I didn't reply. I simply picked up a mug, poured myself some water, and returned to the bedroom. Anger simmered within me, but not a single word escaped my lips. My phone vibrated in my hand. It was my alarm, but instead of dismissing it, I opened the business card and dialed the number. "Hello?" A confident voice answered on the other end. "Maria." "Yes," I said, and at that moment I understood there was no turning back. "I'm ready to meet." We agreed to meet at a small cafe in the city center. Artyom had left for errands, and I seized the opportunity. When I entered the cafe, Ivan Sergeyevich was already waiting. He sat at a table by the window, dressed in a smart suit with a cup of black coffee. "I'm glad you came," he said, standing up. "I didn't know where else to turn," I admitted. He nodded, looking intently into my eyes. "So, let's get straight to it. Do you have copies of the property documents?" "No. My mother never showed me anything." "Then we will search." He took out a folder and placed it on the table. "And I work with lawyers. I have connections. If your husband legally transferred the property to himself, we will investigate whether it was done properly." I nodded silently. "But you must understand," he added, "this process could be lengthy. What's important is this. You must be prepared for a fight." I sighed. "I don't know if I have the strength." Ivan Sergeyevich smiled gently. "I knew your mother. She was a woman of iron will. I believe her daughter will manage." Those words struck me deeply. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of support. The following days became a blur of phone calls, meetings, and document searches. Ivan Sergeyevich introduced me to his lawyer, a woman in her 40s named Ksenia. She was strict, professional, and immediately took charge. "The first thing we need," she said, flipping through papers. is to request statements from the Unified State Register of Real Estate. We need to see when and on what grounds the house was registered to your husband." I listened, my insides churning. Images of my mother, her trusting eyes, flashed before me. She had always believed in people. Perhaps Artyom had exploited that. "Maria," Ksenia looked at me, "are you prepared for the truth to be unpleasant?" "I'm already living an unpleasant truth," I replied. "It can't get any worse." Artyom behaved as if nothing had happened. Sometimes he was affectionate, brought me flowers and said, "You understand, all of this is trivial." But more often, he was cold and irritable. He believed he had everything under control. One evening, after he'd had a drink and settled in front of the television, I asked, "Artyom, tell me honestly, did Mom sign the house documents herself?" He smirked. "What difference does it make now? You won't prove anything anyway." Those words were like a knife. I went out onto the balcony so he wouldn't see my tears. A week passed. Ksenia called and said, "We have news." We met at her office. "The house is indeed registered to your husband," she said, looking directly at me. "But there's a nuance. Your mother's signature on the contract raises doubts." "What do you mean?" "We've given a copy to an expert, and it's highly likely it's a forgery." I froze. The world around me seemed to crumble. "So, Mom didn't sign it?" "Most likely not," Ksenia replied firmly. "Your husband took advantage of her illness. He found a way to conduct the transaction through a straw notary, but this is a criminal offense." I sat there, unable to utter a word. Ivan Sergeyevich, who had been silent until then, placed his hand on my shoulder. "You see, Maria, the truth always comes out." That night I couldn't sleep for a long time. Artyom tossed and turned beside me, sometimes mumbling in his sleep. I looked at his face and realized I am living next to a person who betrayed not only me, but also my mother. Deep within me, a feeling I had never known before began to stir. Not just resentment, not just pain. It was resolve. I was no longer a victim. A few days later, Ksenia and I filed a statement with the prosecutor's office. Artyom found out when he received a summons. "This is your doing," he roared, throwing the envelope onto the table. "Are you out of your mind? Do you think you'll succeed?" For the first time in a long time, I looked him directly in the eye and calmly said, "I think I will." He turned pale. In that moment, I understood that the power he had wielded all these years was beginning to crumble. Ivan Sergeyevich remained by my side. He helped, advised, and supported me. And the more I interacted with him, the clearer it became. This man was truly grateful to my mother and was now doing everything for me. Not for gain, not for calculation, but for duty and remembrance. One evening, after a court hearing, we emerged from the building. Rain was drizzling and the asphalt glistened. "You know," I said, "I keep thinking, Mom probably knew you would appear one day." Ivan Sergeyevich looked at me seriously. "She knew one thing, that she had raised a strong daughter, and I see she wasn't mistaken." I smiled, the first smile in many days, but the hardest part lay ahead. Arbitration, a prosecutor's investigation, interrogations. All of this was just beginning, and with it, my new life was also starting. From the day Artyom received the summons, he changed. The self-assurance with which he usually dictated our lives vanished. He became nervous, irritable, often locked himself in his study and frantically searched the internet. "Do you realize they could imprison me because of you?" he yelled, clenching his fists. "No, Artyom," I replied softly but firmly. "It's not because of me. It's because of what you did." For the first time in a long time, I saw fear in his eyes. He was accustomed to everyone obeying him. Me, my mother, his drinking companions, but now that's a force he couldn't influence had entered the game, the law. The case proceeded slowly but inexorably. At the first hearing, the prosecutor read out the results of the expert examination. My mother's signature had indeed been forged. I listened, feeling my heart contract. Artyom attempted to object. "She asked me to register the house to myself. She trusted me." But his words sounded hollow, even to himself. Ksenia, our lawyer, stood up and said confidently, "Your Honor, we have evidence that at the time of signing the contract, the plaintiff's mother was in a critical state of health and could not appear before the notary. Furthermore, the signature does not match the samples as confirmed by the expert examination." I looked at her and was amazed. This woman was a true warrior, and at some point, I realized that thanks to her and Ivan Sergeyevich, I was no longer alone. After the hearing, Artyom tried to speak with me in private. "Masha," he began unexpectedly softly, "let's settle this. You'll get the money and I'll keep the house. Why do you need these lawsuits?" I looked at him and understood. This was not remorse, but the fear of losing his prize. "You know, Artyom," I replied, "before, I was afraid of being without a home, but now I'm afraid of being without myself." He turned pale, pursed his lips, and left, slamming the door loudly. That evening, I felt the point of no return had been crossed. While the trial was ongoing, Ivan Sergeyevich stayed close by more and more often. Sometimes he would simply come over and quietly drink tea with me in the kitchen. Other times he would share stories from the past, how my mother once pulled him out of trouble, how she gave him back his life when he was on the brink. "I always knew I had to repay that debt," he would say. "But honestly, I think it's not just about the debt, but about your mother teaching me to believe in people." These words warmed me more than any blanket. The trial lasted several months. Artyom did everything he could to drag out the proceedings. But the truth was on our side. And then came the day when the judge read out the verdict. The contract was to be declared invalid. The house was to be returned to the heir, Maria Petrova. The case materials were to be sent to the prosecutor's office for the initiation of criminal proceedings regarding document forgery. I sat there, unable to believe my ears. The house, my mother's house, was coming back to me. Artyom jumped up, shouting something incoherent, but the bailiffs quickly escorted him out of the courtroom. I sat there, tears streaming down my cheeks. They were not tears of pain, but tears of liberation. A few weeks passed. I returned to my mother's house. It was old, and in places it needed repairs, but every wall, every photograph on the shelf breathed with memories. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea. A gentle breeze rustled the trees. The sun was setting. Ivan Sergeyevich sat down beside me. "Well, mistress of the house," he said with a smile. "Did we manage?" "We managed," I corrected him. We sat in silence for a long time. It felt as though my mother were nearby watching everything and smiling. I thought of Artyom. Now he awaited trial as the accused. His life was crumbling like a house of cards, and for the first time in many years, I felt no fear, no pity, only emptiness and lightness. I looked at Ivan Sergeyevich and said, "You know, I was always afraid of being left alone, but it turns out I was never alone." He nodded quietly, because beside strong women, there is always someone. And at that moment, I understood my new life was just beginning.